Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Networking Technologies for ISPs. Today I will give a brief introduction on VLAN and how to configure your Cisco switches. So before we start, let's understand what is a VLAN. VLAN is short form for Virtual Local Area Network. It can be used to logically divide a layer 2 broadcast into two separate domains. We can group the host by the floor that they are on, or the building that they are in, or the department that they work in, or by any other such resource that the customer wants. By division of broadcast, what does it actually mean? On the left here you see a switch which has four hosts which are on a single VLAN, and therefore they are on a single broadcast domain. That is, if host 1 broadcasts, host 2, 3 and 4 can listen to it. Whereas if you see on the right hand side, the LAN is divided into two broadcast domains. One has host 1 and host 2, and the second broadcast domain has host 3 and host 4. Which means that if host 1 to broadcast, only host 2 will listen to it, but host 3 and 4 cannot listen to it. Also note that if host 3 and host 1 wanted to communicate on an IP address, they will need a router in between. They cannot directly communicate through the switch. If the switch is layer 3, yes, then they can communicate, but otherwise they cannot. Let's see VLAN in action now. If we wanted to have three separate VLANs for each of our host 1, 2 and host 3, we can configure it in the router as VLAN 10, 20, 30, and we can have a separate VLAN 100 for management of our infrastructure. That is for management of our distribution switch, our access switches. On the distribution switch, we can subdivide these VLANs coming from router into appropriate path and send them or direct them to our access switches as per our requirement. Similarly, on the access switch end, we can do a similar division and send the VLAN packets as required to host 1, host 2 and host 3. That is VLAN 10, VLAN 20 and VLAN 30. There are various modes of operations of VLAN. The first is access VLAN. In this scenario, the port connecting host 1 to the access switch 1 is an access VLAN port. Similarly, host 2 connected to access switch 2 is an access VLAN port. The second mode is trunk mode. Trunk mode basically means that we are just passing the VLANs through the switch. If we look back at this scenario, the distribution switch here is acting as a trunk VLAN. How? It is trunking the VLAN that is coming from the router to access switches as per requirement. So it is just passing VLAN 110 to access switch 1, VLAN 100 and VLAN 220 to access switch 2, VLAN 100 and VLAN 30 to access switch 3. The next two, voice and native VLAN, we will understand them in a bit. First, let's understand what VLAN ranges do we have that we can configure in our switches. The VLAN ID is 12-bit, that is, it can have up to maximum of 4096 values, starting from 0 to 4095. But VLAN 0 and VLAN 4095 are reserved for system only. VLAN 1 is the default value that comes installed in the switch, which cannot be deleted. We can use VLAN 2 to 1001 for creating, editing, or deletion as per our requirement. VLAN 1002 to VLAN 1005 are reserved in Cisco switches for FDDI and token ring. Then VLAN 1006 to VLAN 4094 is the extended range available. Again, we can create, edit, or delete these VLANs. Note, in Cisco switches, some VLANs are automatically reserved for internal usage. This happens only in special cases. To check if your switch has reserved some VLANs for some usage, internal usage, you can use the command show VLAN internal usage. We can add VLANs through two methods. One, in configure mode, where the syntax is VLAN and then the VLAN ID. And two, we can use VLAN database in executive mode to enter or add VLANs. An access VLAN port will carry only one VLAN. It is usually configured for an endpoint device, such as your computers, your servers. So any traffic coming to these ports, even without a VLAN ID or VLAN tag, will be considered as it belongs to that VLAN group. To configure access VLAN, first we need to add a VLAN to the VLAN database of the switch using the command VLAN ID in configure mode. Once we have added that, in the interface command, we need to specify that the interface is going to act in the access mode. We define this access mode by switch port mode access. Once we have defined that, then we can assign the VLAN to this access port by using the command switch port access VLAN VLAN ID or VLAN name. You can use either of the two, but in case of VLAN name, the syntax will be switch port access VLAN name and then the VLAN ID name. Next is trunk VLANs. VLAN trunks are used between 2 points which are going to be carrying more than one VLANs. For example, in this scenario, the distribution switch ports were acting as only trunk VLANs, wherein they were carrying multiple VLANs to other switches. In Cisco switches, you can have either 802.1q standard or ISL, that is inter-switch link standard. Note that ISL is Cisco proprietary standard, so it will only work with Cisco switches, whereas 802.1q is an industry standard, so it will work with third-party switches also. To configure a port as a trunk port, we need to get into the configure mode, add VLAN to the database, and then in the interface command, we need to define that port as the trunk port. We use command switch port mode trunk to tell the switch that this port will act as the trunk port. Note that by using command switch port mode trunk, will only make the port trunk but will not actually pass any VLANs until and unless we tell the switch which VLANs it has to pass. To configure this, we use the command switch port trunk allowed VLAN. Here we can give VLAN IDs, or we can say all, none. We can add VLANs to existing IDs if they were already added. We can remove VLAN IDs if we want to remove certain VLAN IDs that we had previously added, or we can use except command wherein we want to add all the IDs except these IDs, specified ID. Note, in case you are doing scripting and automation, then it will be very wise to use add or remove instead of just inserting all the VLANs all the time. The next mode is voice VLAN. Voice VLAN mode is a special mode in Cisco switches to carry voice and data on the same Ethernet interface. On this, the voice VLAN is trunk and the data VLAN is an access port, making this as an hybrid port on which you can carry both trunk and access VLANs simultaneously. To configure voice VLAN, again, we need to first enter the VLANs into the configuration database, either through configure mode or through executive mode using VLAN database. And in the interface command, we tell the switch that this will act as an access port by using the command switch port mode access. Then we tell the switch which will be the access VLAN ID for this port through the command switch port access VLAN, VLAN ID, and subsequently we enter one more command now which will be switch port voice VLAN, VLAN ID. This will be the VLAN ID of the voice channel that we are configuring on this port. This configuration is very similar to the access VLAN configuration, but there is an additional command of switch port voice VLAN, VLAN ID telling the switch that there is a voice channel also on this port which has to be tagged with a VLAN ID. Next is native VLAN. By default, native VLAN is 1 on the switch. Native VLAN refers to the tag that the packet will get while incoming into the network through the port in case there is no VLAN ID on the packet. And all tag traffic of that VLAN ID on the network can outflow from that port natively without any VLAN getting configured on the endpoint or distribution point which is connected to that port. For security purposes, native VLAN is usually configured as an unused VLAN ID of the network. To configure native VLAN, we need to define the port as a trunk port and then use the command switch port trunk native VLAN VLAN ID. Native VLAN IDs on switch 1 and switch 2 on either side of the link can be different, but this will cause the packet to jump from one VLAN ID to another VLAN ID, and this is known as VLAN hopping, and this can cause a security issue also in the network. I hope you liked today's video. Do let me know in comments what you think. Please do subscribe to my channel to get the updates of latest videos. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.